Thank you for coming to my daddy's podcast. Daddy's going to start right now.
Welcome back to the Lessons for Success show. I'm your host, Adam Wardlaw, a middle school science teacher and a high school football coach here in the great state of South Carolina. I just want to thank everybody that's been supporting the show so far. Lessons for Success has now been heard in over 5 countries and over 22 states here in America. Hopefully, you've all gained some valuable insight from our guests so far on the show. Remember that new episodes come out every Sunday, and the show is available everywhere where podcasts can be found. Keep up with the show on our social media accounts at L4S Show or use the hashtag L4S Show. Again, that's the number 4. You can also send in messages to the show by downloading the Anchor app. Feel free to send in any questions or comments related to the show so it can be featured in future episodes of the podcast.
Daddy, who's the guest on your podcast this week?
This week's guest is Elisabeth Bostwick. Elisabeth Bostwick is a multi-award-winning educator who is passionate about creating the conditions to spark curiosity and unleash creativity to empower learning. She's the author of Take the Leap, Ignite a Culture of Innovation. In this episode, Elisabeth discusses the necessary steps that should be taken in order to create a culture of innovation in your classroom or your organization. You can follow Elisabeth on Twitter at Elisabeth Bostwick. Enjoy.
Hey there, thanks so much for having me on. I'm Elisabeth Bostwick, and I was born and raised in upstate New York in the Finger Lakes region. So whenever I say I'm from New York, people tend to think of the city life. And so it's not quite the city life here. We are right outside of the Finger Lakes, nearest to Seneca Lake. So we've got some rural and suburban type areas. I grew up in this area, and I grew up really enjoying most of school. But what I loved the most was playing with my pets at home, playing with my friends, making up games, and just running around the neighborhood. When I was in school, as much as I loved being with my friends and I loved so many of my teachers who had a positive impact on me, I also had some distinct moments that really made me just begin to shut down in school. And my first memory of that is from first grade. And when I was in first grade, I remember really struggling to understand math. The reason I didn't understand the math is what I think, at least in my mind, is that I was out of school absent because I was sick and I would miss school for 3 days. And when I came back, suddenly we were doing something double-digit addition, and it was something I'd never done before. So I was making silly mistakes, but nobody really helped me with that. Instead, I was made to feel embarrassed. I was ridiculed. And I just remember at that moment how much I just wanted to hold everything in and not be who I was or not share that I didn't understand something, because that can be really intimidating for kids, you know? And so going through school, I had those moments where I would do really well in some areas, and then other areas I just didn't feel that confident in what I was doing. And when I fast forward to my college years, I had no idea what I was going to major in, no clue. I got accepted into the State University of New York in Cortland, so it was about 45 minutes from home. And I was excited to go to college, and I was ready to knock everything out of the park, but didn't know what I was doing. So I had an undeclared major at the time, and I may have been liberal arts. So people I know in today's world, I hear people joking about that. But to me at the time, I just wasn't ready to decide. About a few months in, I did declare a major, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to be a geography major. And it was totally not what I was meant to do. I think I'd taken a course and it was like, oh, this is cool. So I decided I would give that a shot. Well, I realized that wasn't really my strengths, what I was most strong in. So I ended up going and turning to drama. All through my youth, I was a dancer. So I did ballet and modern and jazz. And so I thought, you know what, maybe performing is where I would like to be. And I'll never forget one of the first classes in the drama class that I was in, we had to act out an animal being born. And the animal I chose was a kangaroo. Can you even imagine what this would have looked like? So, here I am, and I'm like, okay, I don't know why I'm thinking this is a good idea. So, I felt kind of lost, but at the same time, I had great friendships. I was learning a lot. I felt like I was exploring all types of the interests that I had. But for me, I had to latch onto an interest that was also going to be an interest that I could develop into a strength. And so I also knew I loved psychology. I always was interested in human behavior. I'm not sure who's not. In fact, some of you are probably thinking that it's my human behavior of doing the birth of a kangaroo is probably hysterical. But, I was really interested in how the brain works and human behavior. Mental illness was also a strong interest of mine. And so I began taking psychology courses. And that is when it just clicked. At some point we started talking in one of my classes about how the brain learns. And I made connections to, oh my gosh, this is why I wasn't making some of the connections I did in school. So we were really focusing in on those classes we learn through having great relationships with people that we are in the room with. We learn through play. We learn when we have incremental success. And so I started just really putting it together with my past schooling experience. I should share too that at the same time when I was exploring psychology, I had a boyfriend who is my now husband. And so he was majoring in education. He kept trying to convince me to go into education. I'm like, absolutely not. Like, have you seen what school's like? That is not going to be me. I'm not going to be a teacher telling kids to go line up and sit down and when to go to the bathroom. Because that was just some of my experience. And just to also clarify, I did have some phenomenal teachers who really did inspire me, which if you ever check out my blog, I do highlight that and same thing in a book, then I'll share that later. But really a lot of my experiences were just not inspiring to me. And so going through my psychology courses, I started realizing like, man, I could totally shake up education. I could go in and do something completely different because although sometimes I lacked that confidence, I also had this huge mindset that like I could change the world. And that might be silly, but that was who I was. I was like 19, 20 years old. And so I went into the education major. And as soon as I went in, I was like, this is my home. This is where I'm meant to be. I had professors that really just struck a chord with me. Like they were showing us videos about kids chanting about pass the test in their school districts. And he was never telling us that it was right or wrong, but he would like to play devil's advocate. And like, how does that make you feel? What do you think about 10-year-olds chanting this in a school and parades about state testing? And so it evoked this new feeling in me of, you know what, learning is more than testing. And there's so much more when it comes to learning that we could be doing to get kids to become passionate, lifelong learners and not just learning to get to the next level, which is what I had always learned to do. And so I graduated and I got my first teaching job, and it was in New York, back in my hometown. My husband and I, we didn't think we were going to be back here, but we both landed jobs here and we were really happy. And I had great colleagues I was working with. And then before you knew it, our firstborn came along. And so I was home with him for a short time. And then a couple of years later, we had our second child. And so when we had our second child, I took a little bit extra time off because our firstborn, Julian, he was in preschool at the time. And so it was part day and he needed transportation. So it just made sense for me to take a little bit more time off. And so in that time off, I had an opportunity to step back from teaching. When I was in the classroom during the first year, maybe even the first couple of years, I went in thinking that I was going to create waves and bring this transformational experience to students. And then I realized that I was like a tiny fish in this big system, so to speak. I realized it wasn't as easy as I thought it was going to be. I was faced with a lot of different challenges and I wasn't equipped to handle them the way that I thought I was going to be able to. And just to give you an example of that, I knew that I believed in the heart of having relationships above anything else. But suddenly the stress and knowing that standardized assessments were coming and that I was going to be judged by somebody, like somebody was going to say, either you're a great teacher or you're not a great teacher based on these test scores, it was terrifying to me. And it brought back that insecurity and the lack of confidence that I had. And so almost like somebody floating out in an ocean who's going to grapple for a an inner tube or a flotation device, that's what I did. And I went back to what I knew as a student. I went back to, okay, well, here's our behavior chart. You're either doing well or you're not doing well. And if you're doing well, you're going to earn something in return. I had a big focus on, we need to complete all of this work in order to go to recess, or even homework completion. And I don't know when this happened in me, but somehow in my first year of teaching, I felt like, well, if we didn't complete this in today's class, it now becomes homework. Now, remember, I was teaching fourth graders. So I look back on that and I'm like, oh my gosh, what was I doing? But even being home with my two boys at that time, I had the realization, like I had a complete epiphany, like this is not right. What I was doing was not right. It's not even what I went out to do. But I did what I knew, and I did what others around me were doing. And I can honestly sit here today and say I did what I knew was best given the circumstances. Like I had good intentions. I was never intentionally trying to do anything wrong. But, being home with our kids at that time, and just stepping back from everything, I was able to watch their natural curiosity come to life. I saw them learning at a quick rate and being excited about learning, not dreading it. And then when our oldest was he was our firstborn, he was in pre-K at the time, but he was so excited to go to school, couldn't wait. But then about a month in, he was crying and he didn't want to go. And I'm like, why don't you want to go to school? And he explained to me, he's like, well, I can't color in the lines. He lacked some of the fine motor skills and he couldn't cut on the lines. Mm-hmm. And so his teacher had a big emphasis on coloring inside the lines and using the right color. Like if you're coloring in an apple, it needs to be red. Otherwise, she's going to make a comment on the paper. And it was making him feel awful. And I made this whole connection back to when I was in first grade. I'm like, no, we can't go down this road. And I talked to many other parents who are experiencing the same feelings. Again, teachers, I think all are doing the best they know. I don't think there's such a thing as a teacher who has a bad intention. Just sometimes we don't know the best way, or we're doing what we think is the best way. And so during that time, I started really working with him to encourage him to follow his imagination and his curiosity, and to stop worrying about coloring in lines, and let's worry about creating our own artwork. And like, what does that look like? And how can we create our own artwork of using materials outside, which now you can make connections to science. And I really it's this whole working with my children when they were young and seeing his experiences, it relit the fire in me for what I originally intended to go into the classroom to do. So it's kind of where I am today now.
So, some of the things you mentioned that I've been jotting down stuff this whole time. I think, a lot of things you said are a lot of which I felt as a new teacher. New teachers out there, they come in wide-eyed and very motivated and think that all this change is going to happen, and they kind of realize that there's a lot of things that are stagnant. But something I made sure to put a star beside was what you said about creating lifelong learners or students who want to become lifelong learners. And, this could even kind of go out to the adults out there who listen, who are way out of school now, maybe in a professional career. But, how can you spark yourself to become a lifelong learner? Have you learned anything along the way about what kind of leads people to learn more, even as they get out of school and on with the rest of their lives?
Well, to me, I think that learning, everything it boils down to, a lot of people talk about what you're interested in, but the bottom line is when it comes to students and even some adults, they don't always know what they're interested in unless you expose them to those interests, which is why I'm a big believer in bringing in makerspace and project-based learning and really creating authentic learning opportunities that feel deeply meaningful to students, or even to adults. I mean, if somebody can find something they're passionate about, or that makes them feel empathetic. For example, like we've done a lot with working with kids on how do we help with one of the goals of zero hunger in the world. The United Nations has sustainable development goals. And so some kids might be like, they might not understand the point in that. But some of them, if you can reach them with some of the struggles and develop the empathy and the human connection, they develop an interest in something that they didn't have before. And so I think becoming a lifelong learner is being open to exploring new ideas and just new avenues so that you can continue to grow yourself. And I think that even when we talk about learning, like, I think you and I are mostly talking about learning new information or content, but I think we're always learning just even in how we interact with people. I remember when I returned back to the classroom, I did go back, and this time I'm like, nope, I'm really going to stick to my guns. I'm going to do what I really set out to do. And I did, but it took time. And I learned a lot from that. Like, I also learned that sometimes if you're too exuberant and you're doing something that is different and people don't understand it completely, you also are at the risk of possibly isolating yourself, which is what happened to me. I was on a grade level team one time where I was completely isolated by my peers or my colleagues, and here we were adults. So, I think with our students, we see that with them too, but it's also learning, how do you move through those situations, because it's uncomfortable. It makes you feel sick to your stomach. And then you have to figure out, well, how do I navigate this type of a situation? And in that situation, I did everything that I could. Because some people just, if you're doing something different, it makes them uncomfortable, and some people will just shut you out with that. But in that time for me, it was important that I had to pick up my feet and find a new team to join into. And fortunately, I was on several other teams throughout my years, just because I would change grade levels at different times just to gain different experience. And sometimes it's because we didn't have enough students coming up, so it created a bubble. And so I've worked with some phenomenal teams where we all embraced each other for our strengths. And so I think that's been a huge learning opportunity as well.
Well, you kind of mentioned people being afraid of kind of things that are different. People don't like the unknown. And there's a lot of people out there in every workplace. You've got, at least in my opinion, pockets of people who are kind of willing to jump out there and take these risks and things like that. But you've also got pockets of people who do contribute to that stagnant state. When you're trying to motivate people who are, they seem like they're opposed to learning these new things, do you have any tips or experiences of things that worked when, working with these types of people who you're trying to encourage to want to take on some of these new innovative things, whether it's in a school building or maybe in a workplace?
I always share when I go out and work with schools or at conferences, I share the story about being at a ropes course with my family. And this is what I compare this type of a situation to, is that there was one time we were at the ropes course as a family. And as I looked at our youngest son, Nolan, he literally had zero fear. He was going from obstacle to obstacle. And at some points he was holding onto his harness, lifting his legs and saying, "Look, Mom, no feet." And I think a lot of that was because he wanted to see my reaction at the time. But he had zero fear, because when we walked in, the guides there showed us that we could completely dangle without falling into our demise. And now our other son, Julian, he wanted to know all the nuts and bolts before he moved forward in a challenge. He didn't have fear, but he wanted to have the information before going anywhere else forward on the challenge. And then my husband, Mike, he's a principal and he's a risk taker when it comes to education, but he has literally a physiological fear when it comes to heights. But nonetheless, he was there that day on the ropes course. And so he started to take 1 step, 2 step, 3 steps forward. And then before you knew it, his knuckles turned white and he just retreated to safety because he felt like sick, that wave of nausea that comes over you, your fingers are numb. And I use that as an example to illustrate that some people can have the intention of, I'm going to take this risk. I'm going to push myself. Because he said that day, he's like, I'm not going to leave all of you to go. I'm going to push through this. I'm going to do it. But I use that as an example because just because somebody might seem resistant, it doesn't mean that they're the biggest fans of the status quo club, but more so, sometimes they just need more support or time. So even with my son, Julian, like we have people like this in our organizations. We have some people that want to know all the nuts and bolts before moving forward. And it's not that they won't try something different when it comes to learning, but they need the information. And then, of course, you always have people that are innovating or taking on new challenges and have that growth mindset that if they fail, they're going to persevere to continue to be successful. And so I guess my suggestion that when you're working with so many different personalities, it really boils down to having those real, authentic relationships, knowing what makes people tick, knowing how you connect with people. And I have found there's a lot of potential when you share ideas with people and then ask them for their help, rather than saying, I'm going to do this cardboard box challenge. Here's the materials. Why don't you join me? But reverse it and say, hey, I want to do this cardboard box challenge. I have an idea with it, but you're really good at planning. Will you help me with it? And we could do this as a team. I think when we can invite people to partner with us, and when they know that they're not alone, I think that makes all the difference. But you also need the learning and understanding and baby steps. Like, nobody has to go out on a limb and do everything at once. I think it's about making small shifts in the classroom. And even with, I know that you work with students, but it's even helping our students make gradual progress. And whether it's sharing out in the classroom, seeking feedback from somebody else, that can be scary. And I think all of those experiences are what allow us to grow and then influence others.
I think this is a perfect time to segue kind of into your book. Your book's called Take That Leap. And I'm just going out on a limb and guessing that, part of your book has to do with this process of kind of getting people to jump out there or be innovative, or, maybe whoever the reader is, maybe encouraging them and giving them ways that they can kind of get out there and kind of do some different things. I'm really curious as to kind of the premise of the book and kind of what that process was like, and when you decided you wanted to kind of author the book. I'm really interested to hear that story.
Yeah, sure. So the book is Take the Leap, Ignite a Culture of Innovation. And so I think a lot of people, when they first hear that title, they think it's all about technology and innovative approaches, in which there is some in there. But really, the book brought together a lot of my experiences. I share a lot about my own stories that I shared with you a little bit today. I've shared about my youngest child's experiences in school. And that's one I didn't get into yet today, but we can save that for another time too. But the book really focuses on how we can create our schools to be places where students explore, inquire, and really unleash creative thinking within a supportive, collaborative environment. So there's a huge focus on how do we create that culture. It even dives into a little bit about leadership and how do we work with different leaders and be collaborative with each other, that it's not all just, shouldn't always be hierarchical leadership where top-down decisions are made, but how do we bring in shared decision making? So there's that piece within the culture. So LEAP is actually an acronym, and it is broken down into how do we create that luminous culture, one that shines a light on every individual's creative potential, how we can empower learning through encouraging students to take ownership of their education and not just doing school and doing assignments because their teacher said you have to go do this, but how did they take it to the next level and make it their own? And then learning is so powerful when it's authentic. So the A in LEAP stands for authenticity in learning, where we can explore how to tap into passions to create relevant learning experiences for students. And in that section, I really dive into just giving ideas for incorporating makerspace, project-based learning, or even passion-based learning. Not every teacher can sit there and say, oh, I'm going to do all of these, and you don't have to. So to create a culture of innovation, it's in the whole title of Take the Leap. The whole concept behind that is, it doesn't mean you have to necessarily dive into everything, but take the leap and try something. Pick one shift that you feel comfortable with and give it a shot and go back and do it again and find what works for you. And ultimately, the P in LEAP stands for potential. And so we're really looking at igniting a movement of inspired, confident learners, which kind of goes back to me thinking about myself as a child. And I think that's who I wanted to be. And I kept trying to break free from somebody who felt sometimes insecure with who I was and my direction in life. And so ultimately I look at my own children, I think about my own experiences. And so the book kind of blossomed from all of that. And I never expected to write a book. I've always kind of thought about it and played with the idea in my head, but I really thought I was going to write a children's book. And I just began writing these ideas down, and I just felt so compelled to share what worked for me, because I was having so many parents say, my kid actually wants to come to school this year. Even at the end of the year, they're like, I didn't have to make my kid get out of bed and go to school. They were like eager. They couldn't wait to go back to school. And we had those conversations, but well, what was it? What were they enjoying? And I wanted to put that in a book to share what worked for me and hopefully spark ideas in other people.
Well, and I think kind of the concept behind it, maybe in this case it's specific to, the classroom environment, but really any sort of environment where it's a group of people trying to work together to achieve some sort of goal, whether it's a company or something like that. I think a lot of lessons can be drawn for just that whole idea of taking risk and having that support behind the risk. Something I learned that, whether it's a new boss coming into town or a new principal or a new coach on a team that might be trying to instill some new program or whatever the case is, you can come in and say that, hey, we're just going to do this. But a lot of people are going to resist to that simply because you don't have that kind of support behind it. And so, I think what this book seems to do a great job of is provide people out there with kind of some of the evidence for why we should be doing these things and examples. Elisabeth, I appreciate the time you've given me this afternoon. One thing I like to do to kind of wrap up the interviews is just to kind of summarize in your own words. If you felt there were a few keys to success for anybody that's out there listening that wants to achieve more in their own life, what sorts of keys to success would you recommend that they go out and try to embody?
Okay, well, I think that my keys for success that people could go out and embody, it really comes down to finding out who you are and being true to you. And I think my whole life, I knew who I was, and I kept trying to break free from what I felt like I had to be and just trying to become who I'm meant to be. And I think that when we can just step back a little bit and have faith in who we are and begin to take risks in showing people who we are, it makes a huge difference. And I think back to a lot of my experiences as a child. Like I think back to, well, you know what? Whether or not I may have felt unsure of things, but I wish that I'd spoken up to other teachers, because I know that there are teachers there that would have embraced me and helped me work through everything, but I just didn't know to do that. So really being able to go out of, sometimes we have those feelings of, nope, I can't do that. I can't say that. I can't ask for something. But I just encourage everybody to always go after what they dream of and what they feel they need to do and take that risk, because the worst thing that can happen is that somebody can say no. But I think when we're true to who we really are, that's when we reach the most success. And additionally, I think that just looking at the needs in the world and looking at how we can support others around us. I think if we can give back by uplifting those around us, it has a ripple effect that it comes back to us as well.
Well, I think, the idea is that it has a lot to do with relationships, and relationships take some sort of investment. And so, if people out there were to just begin investing in each other, a lot of these things would become more accessible in terms of the innovation that would be available and all that. Elisabeth, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. If anybody out there that's listened to the podcast wanted to keep up with you or get in touch with you, whether it's social media or your website, do you mind sharing that information?
Sure. So you can find my website. It's elisabethbostwick.com. The only tricky piece is that Elisabeth has an S instead of a Z. So I've always had to follow up with that. And then my Twitter handle is Elisa Bostwick. So it's ELISA and then my last name Bostwick. And so you can find me on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook.
Daddy, I'm learning so much from this podcast.
I really enjoyed my conversation with Elisabeth and jotted down a ton of notes from our discussion. Let's review this lesson for success. Elisabeth's examples of risk-taking and innovation provided great insight into the things that help or hinder innovation. Elisabeth sums up her philosophy towards creating an innovative culture by using the acronym LEAP. The L refers to shining light on the many people that can make up your classroom or organization and highlighting what their strengths are. The E refers to empowering others by giving them a sense of responsibility and ownership in their process. A refers to authenticity, where there is a passion towards the concept that's being worked with. And lastly, the P refers to potential, where the members of the classroom or organization feel confident in their learning and decision making. Whether you're a teacher leading a classroom of students, a coach trying to facilitate a healthy culture for your team, or an employer trying to increase the effectiveness of your organization, Elisabeth's insight provided a framework to accomplish this. Well, that's it for this week's Lesson for Success. Be sure to interact with the show on Twitter and Instagram at L4S Show, mentioning us or using the hashtag L4S Show. Again, that's the number 4. Episodes will also be placed on the YouTube channel Lessons for Success Show. Download the Anchor app in order to send in messages to the show, and your questions and comments could be featured on future episodes. All of the episodes are available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or anywhere else that podcasts can be found, so be sure to like, subscribe, and rate. Thank you again for listening to the Lessons for Success Show podcast.
That's the end of our show. Thank you for listening.